without further ado, Caroline.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's great to be here and to talk to all of you. The topic is magnet cities, as you know, and essentially, I'm not an accountant, which is probably, I shouldn't admit, in KPMG, but as you know, I am an economist. So I'm coming at cities and looking at cities from the context of economics. And I'm quite obsessed about what makes cities grow, what makes places grow. And this is partially because in the UK, we have a big problem at the moment. We have London, which is a huge city that is doing extraordinarily well, and it's sort of sucking the life out of lots of different cities, and we're sort of letting that happen. So a lot of this research, it really began out of my concern for the UK, and beginning to think, what can we do to try and get these cities to reinvent themselves? And it's been very, very interesting, because cities around the world have taken more and more of an interest in it. So what I thought I'd do is flip through some slides that summarize the research. You'll be quite relieved to know that I'm not going to talk about digital. I'm not going to try and sell you sensors or things like that, because I know the whole smart cities language is very much around that. It's a discussion much more around how to make places of great interest. And certainly, those sorts of technologies can be very helpful, but they're not terribly helpful on their own. So we can wrap that up at the end. So to start, and if I come over here, can you still hear me? I'm not sort of terribly great with microphones, but I'll come back. So to begin with, I mean, cities have become a really popular subject. In London, we have tons of kids coming out of university, and they knock on the door, and they call me up, and they say, you know, I really want to be an urbanist. I have absolutely no idea what an urbanist is, but it seems to be this perception that you can go to a place and you can begin to shape it. And again, it's born out of this feeling that cities are really static. They're always there. They're made of concrete. They have roads. You know, you can change things. You can change dynamics. You can change politics. But at the end of the day, a city will be there. But if we sort of do quite a grotesque gallop through history, so for any historians, you know, do forgive me, this is a little obnoxious. But if we go back to the very beginning and what cities were about, if the pointer works, they were built on trade. So does anyone know this picture here, where it's from? It's actually a picture from not that long ago. Any guesses? Not a single guess. Syria, okay, so quite close, absolutely. So that is a city called Samarkand. So Samarkand, there was a book written sort of that title, and Samarkand was a city that sort of like, if you compared today, you put Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, and London all in one city, but in Asia, that's sort of what Samarkand was. I mean, it was like a monster city. And the reason it was such an important city is because it basically sat in the middle of the Silk Road. So basically, if you traded anything, you came through Samarkand, and it connected lots of different places. So the reason that this city became so powerful and so important was because of where it was positioned. It was absolutely nothing to do with anything else. And of course, what happened over time is trade routes changed. People moved in different directions. They were trading different goods. And Samarkand, it did not survive. So over the centuries, it became less and less. And today, if you Google Samarkand, which some of you will, it's basically the second biggest city in Iraq. So given what's happening in Iraq, that's not, you know, really sadly terrific. So you can see a city, you know, over a couple of millennia, so it's very slow progress, essentially has gone from probably the most important city in the globe to a city that most people here in the room would not even recognize, most people in the world would never have heard of. And so cities sort of developed for that reason. There was absolutely no choice about it. It was where the proximity was. And essentially what happened is the Industrial Revolution came about. New cities started to form and to spark up. And those were essentially what we called cities of industry. And so if you think of classic industrial cities like Pittsburgh, like Manchester, again, there is a reason why those cities grew and formed where they were. And it wasn't so much to do with the very valuable things that were under the ground. So in Pittsburgh, it was iron ore. but it was actually to do with the quantity of goods that were needed to transform that iron ore. So in Pittsburgh, the reason it became such an important city is because there was a lot of coke in the ground, which essentially is the main product used to create coal. That attracted a whole bunch of new entrepreneurs and very creative people, most famously a man called Bessemer, who came from Sheffield, which people in Sheffield are still terribly cross about, because he abandoned them, another steel city, and he went to Pittsburgh, designed the Bessemer oven, which essentially was a new way to actually sort of burn coal, create iron, went into alloy steel and all of that. And it's one of the reasons that the city became so great. So if you now think across Europe, lots of different countries in North America as well, a lot of the big cities of the last 100, 120, 150 years were all cities of industry. So now we're going into a slightly different era because, of course, what's happened is many of the industries in those cities have gone to different parts of the world. And so, like the cities I talked about at the beginning in the UK, they're struggling to figure out what is the new purpose, what are they about. And so there is now this emerging third category of city, which is cities of people. And these are cities that basically are competing on the basis of the people they attract. So the very interesting thing about that is, of course, if you are attracting people, you don't necessarily have to be in a particular place anymore. It's a completely different thing. So any city can compete on this basis because it's not linked to your ground and what's in your ground or your place. But the slightly more difficult thing about this is suddenly the barriers to entry are really low. Anyone can do this. If you have a city, you can start to attract people and be that place. And this is this whole new generation of cities and what they're beginning to compete on and how they're beginning to think of things. But as we talked about, lots of cities are finding it very, very difficult to transition from one to the other. And clearly very large capital cities have a combination of those things. So here is the point where I'm going to be slightly controversial. Having spent 3 days in Auckland, so there's nothing like someone making a quick opinion, but I've done my research and spoken to lots of people before I came. I'm going to argue that today, Auckland is actually a city of trade. It is not a city of people. And I think this is the big challenge and what I'm going to talk to you about. And I'll go on to it in the end, but my rationale for this is as follows, is a lot of the reason that people and companies are coming to Auckland at the moment is in order to sell goods and services to people in New Zealand. It is not necessarily because people are coming to Auckland, to live a particularly Auckland quality of life or to be with a whole bunch of people that have also come from other places to do the same. That sounds a little conceptual, and I'll go into it in a bit more detail. So that's not to deride the quality of life or all the other elements that clearly are fantastic. And I think that's the big challenge, is how to sort of retain that city of trade and begin to move into a city of people where it becomes much stickier, and therefore the people are coming here to Auckland and staying here because of the city and not just because a job moved them, and if the job went somewhere else, they would happily go somewhere else. Okay, so let me keep going before, it's very good that you don't have bread rolls or anything like that too. Okay, so as we said, just a moment ago, cities go up and down. We talked about Samarkand goes up, then goes down. And so cities are a bit like stocks and shares. They can go up, they can go down, some quickly, some slowly. And whereas a stock and a share, it has a price, the thinking that we do is around the fact that what is the equivalent of a share price for a city. And so the thinking is it probably is two dimensions. It is population growth and GDP growth. So essentially, if the population is growing and the GDP is growing, then it's the city that's on the ascent. It's growing. Ideally, the GDP growth is greater than the population growth. So that is, the people who are coming in are sort of doing more to the economy than they're providing just by being there and being additional labor. And so on this chart here, on this axis, you can essentially see it's GDP growth. Here we have population growth. So it's very, very simple. as I said at the beginning, look at that cluster there. All of those light green ones are the UK cities. Doom. This is, this is why the worry. Because, of course, what's happening is they have negative GDP growth and positive population growth. And this story is getting worse and worse and worse. And so that's incredibly difficult because what it means is the people who are going into those cities are not contributing economically. They're not helping even the economy to sustain itself. London, which is the great success story, you can see is here. And the only other UK city that's doing particularly well is Bristol, which people know is sort of a bit like a mini London to the south, so it's got a lot of the same vibe going on. So if we move to the New Zealand cities, here we have Wellington, Auckland, and Christchurch. So you can see absolutely fantastic because in the upper right corner, and GDP growth and population growth is great. I have to apologize that the data is a bit out of date. That's not necessarily, our fault. It's because we use OECD data that's completely untouched because this message can be very unpopular. So I tend to feel it's better to use data that has not been touched by anyone, and it takes them a very long period of time to basically pull the GDP data together. So clearly the Christchurch story is very different today, but it would be very similar for these two cities. So it's very easy. If I had those growth figures, in the UK, I'd be absolutely bloody delighted and say, time to rest. This is fantastic. But this is the point of the discussion and what I'll go on to, is there's a real challenge to stay in that upper corner because there are probably 300 other cities of similar sizes, to Auckland, certainly to Christchurch and to Wellington. And everyone is now beginning to compete on this people basis. And so what you will see is those dots move back and forth according to who begins to succeed more or less on that basis. So a lot of the research that we did on this piece, Magnet Cities, was in fact to figure out how do you go from down here, and here you can see cities like Detroit, Cleveland that everyone knows about, to over here. And you would have thought there'd be lots of examples over history, but no, there are not. Because once a city tends to go into that period of decline, it's very, very difficult to pull out of it. And so we went and found about a long list of 50 different cities, and we found that actually only 8, even though we wrote about 9, but I will come on to that, have really managed to turn that corner and to dramatically change the place, the economy, the identity of the city in such a wholesale way that they then completely bounced back, found a completely different population, grew their economy in a different way, and stood for something that was completely different. And so those case studies are written up in the book, and we won't go into them in too much detail. But the very interesting thing is they all did one thing. And this is why these 8 succeeded, and probably the other 150 around the world that have tried failed. And it's because they went through and understood this cycle. So we're very obsessed with this phrase, which is wealth creators. Those 8 cities, what they managed to do was to fundamentally target a population and say, we want these people to come into our city. So a bit like Coca-Cola would actually go and launch a new product. They would know precisely who they were going for. The cities that managed to reinvent themselves did precisely the same thing. They knew the age, they knew where they lived, they knew where they were going to attract them from, they knew how they were going to do it. And the reason they did that is they understood that both cities are about people and businesses are obsessed with good people. And so they recognize that if you get good people into a place, they are the bait. They are the bait that bring in good jobs, creative companies, the rest will follow. And that cycle then continues. So if you go around, you can then help to build the quality of life. Those quality of life dimensions help to support the case to that target audience, and it's like a circle. It goes around and around and around. But this is actually sort of sounds so simple when you talk about it, but most people do it in entirely the opposite way. They start with GDP, and they say, okay, what industry are we going to go after? And let's think about whether or not we want high-skilled jobs or low-skilled jobs. And then what incentives can we put in place to attract said employer to come into the place? And the truth of the matter is, businesses make choices much as people do. And so they make a choice about the place, not just on, the quality of the place, but the people that they can go and grab as well. And so there's always a very good example I tell about Oklahoma City, which is one of these cities that collapsed. And they went and tried that first traditional route. We use it in the UK all the time. So they went after a big employer. It was United Airlines, because they're in the center of the city, and they were convinced that if they got United Airlines, they would fix their city. And so they actually went and raised some money, through direct taxation, Republican state, and they got the people to vote for a 1-cent city tax increase to essentially pay $500 million in cash to United Airlines to come to their city. And United Airlines were very impressed because this was a big Republican state, very Republican city where everyone wears cowboy hat and they have a concealed weapon, so voting for tax is something that does not happen regularly. And they thought about this and they came back and said, thanks terribly for the offer, but we're going to go to a city that did not offer us any money. And the reason is, not that you tend to have, a bunch of qualified people that could do our jobs, but by the way, 200 United Airlines executives don't particularly want to live in your city, which is a bit shit. and it was, a very, very difficult moment for them. And so they went absolutely the opposite way and said, instead, let us go and target people. And so in that instance, the segment that they went after were the 2 generations that had left the city beforehand. And so they went out of their way to curate the city, the culture, the identity, to be a place that those young kids would want to come back to. So in that instance, it was actually quite straightforward, because if you're going to get, a bunch of guys and girls from a Republican state to come back to the Midwest, there was only 2 things you need: sports and beer. And that's what they did. They focused on sports and beer. They got an NBA franchise. They got a hockey team. They built cool new neighborhoods, literally out of the prairie land, with cool bourbon bars, and they created a whole new vibe. And in a period of about 12 to 14 years, they went from a place that was as dead as a doornail to a place that was the second most popular destination for millennials in America to move to. And this was, a place that had nothing. So it's sort of a great example of putting this in place. Now, I realize that I've almost run out of time, but I was very cognizant of the fact that the word smart and digital was mentioned. So what I thought I would do, and also going to the slightly contentious, line I said at the beginning, is I thought I would talk just for a moment about Tel Aviv, because I think that there are many parallels between Tel Aviv and what is happening right now here. And it's not the whole startup culture that everyone's terribly excited about at the moment. But if you go back about 20 years, I would actually say that what was happening in Tel Aviv 20 years ago is very, very analogous to what is happening right now here in Auckland. So 20 years ago, Tel Aviv was a pretty stable, safe place. I'm talking sort of culturally as opposed to anything else. But it was very solid in terms of financial services. All the big banks, had offices there. Insurance. There was a very famous road in the middle of Tel Aviv called Rothschild Boulevard, where sort of all the bankers were. And the population was sort of, slightly older. It wasn't a very young place. And what happened is more and more people started to move into Tel Aviv because it became a very good base by which you could sell products and services to the citizens of Israel, to other parts of the Middle East if possible. But it became a place that was very transactional. It was all about trade. And what happened is because these people wanted a particular type of housing and they wanted particular services, things became very, very expensive. And the city council did not respond. And so what happened is prices went so high that a tipping point started to occur, and young people could no longer afford to live there. They actually didn't particularly want to live there because it was a bit of a, not terribly interesting place. And it went through a difficult period that became even more difficult during the Second Intifada, which was not that long ago, where many people packed up. Many of the businesses said, you know what, this is all looking a bit too dicey. We don't actually have a great commitment to here, so let's pack off and go elsewhere. And so it went into this real collapse period, and many people were betting massively on Jerusalem being the new real capital of the place. And there was an absolute explosion in terms of construction outside of Jerusalem, huge skyscrapers, a huge amount of effort went into it. And a lot of the banks started to move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So my analogy is not dissimilar to what's happening in Christchurch. Because even though I know that there is a lot of difficulty, going on with the progress, the point is they're putting up some pretty splendid big buildings in the middle of the place that could begin to be of interest to some companies who are looking at New Zealand as a place to transact. But the point is, they really came back and they did something very different. And they also decided, forget companies, they are disloyal. What we have to do is to go after a completely different population to change the fabric of the city, to take it from a place that is incredibly conservative to a place that is really interesting. No longer have jobs where they're just basically the jobs of yesteryear in financial services, in those sorts of jobs, where essentially what you're doing is you're attracting a labor force to essentially replace people. They realized what they had to do was to get people in who were essentially going to create the new jobs of tomorrow. Now, what they did is they went after the group who were profoundly disruptive. And they were targeting people who would think in very different ways. And completely hands up, there is a great tradition in Israel to think in that way. So there is sort of a natural vein to it. But the interesting thing is what the city government did do is they took a number of steps to try and accelerate that process. So the first is, and this was actually with the help of the national government, is they set up a venture capital firm because no venture capital firm would come to Israel to set up an office at that point in time because there wasn't enough deal flow, which is not that dissimilar to what's happening today in New Zealand. And so it was called the Yozoomer Fund, which we got up there. And essentially it was backed by the central government who said there will be huge tax breaks for any sort of foreign venture capital funds that come into the city. And most importantly, if you do not make a great return, if you do not double your money in 5 years, the government will step in and pay for that. So I'm not suggesting that's the way forward, but it's certainly, because that would be quite contentious. But the point is, it sent out one hell of a signal to the world that this suddenly was open and behaving in a different way. And they went through this process of beginning to completely change the fabric of the city so it would be very popular to these, to this generation, to this group. They did something which was crazy. They actually started and put in place a gay pride parade. Now, can you imagine sort of conservative Jews with a gay pride parade? I mean, that was not an easy step, but it did more to completely reestablish the identity of Tel Aviv as no longer a sleepy conservative place for an older generation to a place that was very welcoming to everyone. And it was all around this identity of a non-stop city. Everything they do is around this. So literally legislation was changed to encourage bars and restaurants to stay open all night. Wi-Fi, they were the first city that actually had free Wi-Fi across the entire city. There is such, sort of a buzz in the place now that everyone wants to be a young entrepreneur because they've also had a huge number of startups. That literally wherever you go, there are kids coding, sort of thinking that they will be the next big startup. When I was there last, a company called Waze was bought by Google for $1 billion. Now, sort of quite a big sum of money, but the most intriguing thing is every single taxi you got into, every place you went into a restaurant, everyone talked about it. It was sort of shared by everyone, even people who would have no idea what it was or what it worked for. And so it was through this process that they very actively curated over time, that they have transformed the city into a place that is, literally one of the most popular places for young people, whether they are Jewish or not Jewish. If that's the world you want to be in, you go and spend some time in Tel Aviv now. And again, that's happened over a distinctly short period of time. So, final slide is, what does that mean for Auckland? And this is where I get controversial again. So, I would say at this point in time, as an outsider, which can be both good and can be very annoying to people listening, completely realize that, and having spoken to a whole bunch of people, it seems to be a place that is either intentionally or unintentionally targeting young families who've basically decided that they want to prioritize quality of life over perhaps, great wealth, career progress in different countries. And to be totally frank, it's a bit of a downshift, a positive downshift, but a downshift. I expected, again, bread rolls to be thrown at me at this point in time. So I'm going to do something, which is I also did do quite a bit of research on trying to get some documented reasons why people are moving to Auckland. So I'm going to read you two quotes. The first is from a newspaper called the Daily Telegraph in the UK. So it was a big piece on why people are moving to Auckland. And this is one quote from a lady who was 37, and she says, "If I was young, free, and single, I probably wouldn't be moving to Auckland, but I would stay in London. But once you start a young family, then countries like Australia and New Zealand become more appealing. New Zealand and Auckland has a slower pace of life that isn't for everyone." Now, this isn't a bad thing, so please don't look at me so horrified. All I'm here to do is to say, this is the perception of the outside world. And that may be absolutely fine, and that may be absolutely what you want. And that's absolutely okay. But the point is, you have to do it consciously knowing that that's what you want. So if you are attracting this group, many of them, are working for these sorts of companies, okay? And those sorts of companies are the companies that we talked about at the beginning that are using Auckland as the base to sell services, products, both within the country to other countries, but it's very much transactional. It's for that reason. And so as a result, the quality of life, the housing stock, the fact that it's houses, always houses on plots, everything is speaking to this group. Again, it may be by accident, it may be by design. And so what I'd just like to do is to draw you back to that moment in Tel Aviv's history 20 years ago and say, it sort of strikes me that there are some parallels. And so now is the moment to say, actually, that's absolutely right, and that's what we want to do. Or you can say, actually, maybe now is the time we need to be thinking about drawing in, not a huge number, but another new population into the city who are going to begin to think about what the new jobs are, what the new industries are. And it doesn't have to be the dot-com stuff that I talked about in Israel, actually, which is not dot-com-y, it's very sort of communications-based. So it could be things around food technology. It can be things, about new products in big existing companies. But it's that R&D type thinking and research that begins to create new jobs that then end up being based here and start to attract a very different group of people that just adds a bit more grist and a different dimension to the economy that isn't here today. And in that way, there's a bit of diversification. You're also getting a slightly younger population in, because I've also been struck by the fact that the median population age in this city has increased quite dramatically over the last few years. So the population is literally aging. So you do need some new blood in. And so while you still may want the supply of 30 to 40-year-olds who are leaving Sydney, who are leaving London to come and work at the KPMGs, at the same time, you need to be doing something to shore up that younger population, to shore up the sort of professional services dimension. And to do that, there needs to be quite a bit of, rethinking about some of the activities in the city, basically what the identity is, and then my last contentious point is maybe about quite significant urbanization of the center. I will say no more.